Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here on what I think is a very important day for New Hampshire and for the nation. As we all know, today is the day that Hillary Clinton is going to try to save her campaign by going on to Saturday Night Live. We've got a few hours to kill before then, so I'll speak. All right. So many of us nowadays are worried that we may be losing our country. We're worried that the things that make America work and the things that make America great may somehow be slipping away. That America may be caught in a fundamental transformation that's moving more quickly than we can even keep track of, much less stop. And sadly, that feeling is all too justified. As an example, I'm going to talk to you today about an issue which is certainly important and yet which doesn't get the kind of attention reserved for controversies like Obamacare, the Iranian nuclear deal, or funding for Planned Parenthood. I'm talking about the survival of local government in the United States, the right of local or state governments to control what your zoning regulations are, what sort of roads, housing, and schools get built in your towns, what kind of local taxes get levied, and even what your children actually get taught in their schools. Of course, these kinds of things have always been local or state responsibilities. The Constitution leaves these sorts of decisions to the states, and the states traditionally delegate most of these decisions to local governments. Now, for a long time, people have considered this reliance on local government to be an absolutely fundamental key to America's freedom. In fact, it all began here, of course, in New England. The early colonies were almost like little countries unto themselves. They were controlled locally, not by kings back in England. And even when the English kings finally started to assert their control, they limited themselves to certain central powers. They gave up power to the localities because New Englanders, unlike so many of their own subjects, were already used to governing themselves, already accustomed to their freedom. And of course, when the English started to step on that freedom, the colonists kicked them out. Now, when Europeans came to visit the United States in the early decades of the 1800s, they were shocked to see American government working from the bottom up instead of from the top down. And the ultimate in bottom-up government, the most amazing thing of all to these European visitors, was the New England town meeting, which of course has been going on here in New Hampshire for about 375 years now. It was when those European visitors first began to notice New England town meetings and how different they were from anything these Europeans were used to back in their own centrally controlled countries, that the meaning of American liberty started to become clear. Because Americans were used to governing themselves, were confident in governing themselves, and were proud of governing themselves, they refused to accept the kind of infringements on their liberties that people in other parts of the world put up with. And the place Americans learned the most about that freedom was in their local governments, like in those town meetings. And that, of course, is how you got Live Free or Die here in New Hampshire. But local government, this key to what makes America American and what makes America great, is perilously close to slipping away. And it's happening in ways that barely get noticed and barely get talked about in our major national debates. Now, the first example of this problem I want to talk about today is a hugely transformative new housing regulation issued by the Obama administration with very little discussion. It's called, and this is a mouthful, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Regulation. And it's not too strong to say that this regulation goes a very long way toward abolishing local government in America. The Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule amounts to a kind of backdoor annexation of America's towns and suburbs by nearby big cities, with the whole process monitored and managed by the federal government. And the second example I'm going to talk about today is the way that the College Board, the private company that creates the SAT tests and all the high school advanced placement tests, has been taking us very far down the road to a national school curriculum controlled by the political left. And this is something the College Board has been doing with considerable help from both state and federal government. Now, everybody knows that President Obama began his career as a community organizer, but very few people understand the projects that young Barack Obama was actually working on during his community organizing days. It turns out that the community organizers who trained and mentored President Obama were the founders of a movement called regionalism. Basically, Obama's mentors worked in cities, and they didn't at all like suburbs. Obama's mentors blamed the suburbs for the problems of the cities, because when people move out to the suburbs, they take their tax money with them. So the goal of Obama's community organizing mentors was to redistribute suburban tax money to the cities by having cities literally annex their surrounding suburbs. Now, this is actually what happened as a lot of large American cities like New York and Chicago were growing during the 19th century. In those days, as they grew, cities like New York and Chicago would just annex the nearby towns. Now, if big cities across the country started annexing and absorbing nearby towns and suburbs, this would shift America away from a system of local governments that stay close to the people to a system of huge regional governments centered around major metropolitan areas. Well, of course, things have changed since the 19th century, and the leaders of the regionalist movement quickly discovered that nowadays cities aren't allowed to just annex nearby local governments without their consent. So when the regionalist community organizers who trained and mentored Barack Obama found out that annexation just wasn't possible anymore, they started to work on Plan B. They started to look for ways to undercut the political and economic independence of the suburbs so that they could somehow get a hold of all that suburban tax money and redistribute it to the cities. And the program these regionalists came up with had three basic elements. First, do everything you can to discourage people from leaving big cities to move to smaller towns or suburbs. So, for example, some cities like Portland, Oregon, actually draw a boundary around themselves. It's called an urban growth boundary. And outside of that boundary, new development is banned. You can't build new suburbs or towns outside of Portland's growth boundary. And in other cities, regionalists tried to achieve essentially the same thing by cutting off money for highway building or highway repair and channeling that money instead into public transportation. In fact, I think we're going to hear another presentation a little later that touches on this. Now, if part one of the regionalist program is to discourage people from leaving cities, or even to press them back into the cities, the second part of the regionalist program is to move many of the urban poor into the suburbs through the imposition of low-income housing quotas. And the third part of the regionalist program is to institute something called regional tax-based sharing, which we see in its pure form in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. In Minneapolis-St. Paul area, suburbs have been forced by the state to kick in a big chunk of their tax revenues to a common regional pool. And once that money gets pulled, it's redistributed according to a formula that pulls most of that money away from the suburbs and back toward the cities. Well, if you press suburbanites into the cities and you transfer urbanites to the suburbs and you redistribute suburban tax money to the cities, then in a sense you've abolished the suburbs. The municipal boundaries would still exist, but for all practical purposes, the towns and municipalities that surround big cities would have been co-opted into a single metropolitan region. And again, that's why people call the movement that favors these policies regionalism. And President Obama, like the people he worked with all those years ago in Chicago, is a strong supporter of the regionalist movement, as are a great many officials in the Obama administration, especially in places like the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Transportation. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which President Obama's hugely ambitious new rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing aims to fulfill the goals of the regionalist movement. I can only give you a few examples here. I've written a lot more about it at National Review Online and elsewhere. President Obama's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule gives the federal government a lever to re-engineer every American neighborhood, imposing a preferred racial and ethnic and class composition, and making new development much more urbanized, much more densely packed. Under this new federal regulation, towns and suburbs are going to become more like cities, and cities are going to become more like Manhattan. They're going to get more crowded and more dense. And to achieve all of this, the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation casts aside the authority of local governments over their core responsibilities on everything from zoning to transportation to education. So, for example, this new rule forces every municipality that accepts federal housing money to compare their population by race, ethnicity, and class to the population of their entire region. And if there are any imbalances in the demographics, then these localities could be forced to sweep away their own zoning laws, build high-density public housing at their own expense, and import population from other parts of the region. Meanwhile, other localities could be forced, on pain of losing their federal funding, to join regional planning associations that adopt all the basic city planning goals of the regionalist movement. In other words, under the Obama administration, the federal government is going into the business of telling Americans where they should live. In fact, all of this is happening right now in suburban Westchester County, New York. And amazingly, the biggest controversy of all is taking place in Hillary Clinton's hometown of Chappaqua, which is in Westchester County. This is where the Obama administration is trying to force the local town council to build high-density, low-income housing at its own expense and import tenants from nearby cities. Yet Hillary Clinton has so far refused to comment on this controversy, and no one in the media and no one among her political rivals have yet asked her about it. But if Hillary Clinton becomes our next president, then President Obama will have handed her the ultimate tool for re-engineering the United States, a regulation that makes a mockery of America's long and proud tradition of local control, a regulation that actually puts the federal government into the business of telling Americans where they ought to live. All right, now I'm going to shift to what might seem like a totally different issue, but what really isn't a different issue at all, because it's all a question of local control. The Constitution left control of America's system of education to the states. And while the states hold final authority over American education, they have traditionally allowed local school districts to have considerable control over how their schools are run. Nowadays, however, I'm sorry to say that all of that is changing. Control of the school curriculum is slipping out of the hands of localities and even of states. Through the Common Core, huge national testing consortia, funded and controlled by the federal government, are removing our schools from the influence of the families and communities who actually use them. Now, I'm sure you've heard all about Common Core. We've heard about it today, of course. But the truth is, Common Core is only the beginning. What most people still don't understand is that the vast government-supported expansion of the high school advanced placement program has put the College Board in a position to impose a de facto national curriculum on our high schools, a curriculum that covers absolutely critical topics like American history, U.S. government and politics, European history, world history, literature, and a great deal more. And as the College Board puts its new curriculum in place, it's handing sharply left-leaning college professors, the ones who advise it, a way to take control of K-12 education in America. Now, I've already talked about the way in which our federalist system, our system of state and local control, cultivates the taste for freedom But there's another reason why our federalist system is so critically important to this country. The founders understood that breaking up central control and allowing for choice and variety at the state and local levels was the surest way to guarantee that no single political faction could impose a tyranny on the rest of the country. Local control of our schools means that no one side in our political battles can force their ideas on the minds of their opponents' children. But now, that critical bulwark of our liberties is under attack. And let me explain how it happened. Until about a year ago, if you were teaching advanced placement U.S. history, all the College Board would have given you by way of instruction was a 4 or 5 page topical outline. As long as you taught about the Mexican War, the Jacksonian period, the Civil War, and so forth, you could teach those topics pretty much any way you wanted. You could teach American history from a liberal perspective, a conservative perspective, or anywhere in between. But just last year, the College Board decided to issue a long and very controlling curriculum framework that effectively forced everyone to teach AP US history from a leftist perspective. The new curriculum was all about conflict by race, ethnicity, gender, and class. And of course, there was a lot about environmentalism as well. There was very little about America's distinctive national character, and a great deal instead about cultivating a sense of global citizenship. Political, diplomatic, religious, and military history were downplayed, and in many cases completely ignored, as were the fundamental principles of American government, principles like federalism and local control. The new curriculum made conservatives look irrational and mean, while liberals, of course, were made to look like heroes, and so on and so forth. Now, some of you may have heard that the College Board's new curriculum guidelines for its AP US history course stirred up a hornet's nest of opposition. And because of that, the College Board recently revised its controversial curriculum framework and claimed that all the problems had been solved. Well, the problems have not been solved. Far from it. Yet the College Board has removed some of the most biased phrases from its new American history curriculum, but the truth is that basic leftward bias is still there. And not only that, but the entire effort at revision was mostly just for show. All the AP US history textbooks, all the course syllabi, all the teacher training materials, and the exam itself have already been changed to conform to the original hyper-controversial left-leaning curriculum. And all of that has stayed exactly the same. So the problem of bias is still there. And meanwhile, the College Board has come out with a brand new curriculum for its AP European history course. And sure enough, it's a virtual twin of the original hyper-leftist American history curriculum. The overwhelming focus is on the evils of colonialism and capitalism, with very little about the problems of socialism, or about religion, or about the development of the principles of representative government. The whole European history curriculum is a leftist college professor's dream, which makes a lot of sense because those are the folks who drew it up. But here's what's really new about all this, and what most people still don't understand. The College Board has decided to drop its usual minimalist course guidelines and issue detailed curricula for every single one of its advanced placement courses. So last year's controversy over AP US history is only the beginning. What's really going on here is that the College Board is using its government-subsidized monopoly of the AP testing market to create an ideologically biased national curriculum. This is a dramatic development. It's exactly the sort of thing that our constitutional system was designed to prevent. And yet it's happening right now, and there is very little public understanding or debate about it. Through the use of government subsidies, the advanced placement program has now expanded to cover 1/3 of all American high school students. So if you control the curriculum of the advanced placement program, you now control the ideas about the meaning of this country, of politics, of society, of culture, and of character held by the 1/3 of young Americans most likely to shape the world we're all going to be living in tomorrow. In effect, David Coleman, the controversial architect of the Common Core, who, not so coincidentally, is right now the president of the College Board, is now in a position to dictate to the country an ideologically charged national curriculum. By means of the College Board's advanced placement program and aided by federal subsidies, Coleman has managed to make an end run around the curriculum-setting authority of state and local governments. So the concern that a national school curriculum could ultimately be used as a tool of cultural control by a single political faction is no longer just a theory. It's happening before our eyes. The only way to stop it is to create an educational testing company that can compete with the College Board, a company advised by top-notch traditional scholars. Competition in the AP testing market would restore true choice and accountability to the curriculum. Competition in AP testing would put control of our educational system back where it belongs, in the hands of state and local governments and the parents and voters those governments represent. I hope and believe that a new advanced placement testing company, advised by top-notch traditional scholars, will emerge within the next year or two. And when it does, it is critically important that government at the state and federal levels take steps to open up the educational testing market to genuine choice and competition. Otherwise, yes. Otherwise, not only will America's tradition of local government have been cast aside, but even the understanding of what our federalist system was and why it was important will have been lost. So, between Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, the Environmental Protection Agency's assault on America's energy production, the collapse of America's position in the Middle East, the deficit, the burgeoning crime rate, and all the other fundamental transformations we're witnessing every day, it's easy to overlook America's system of local government and what our children are taught about our history and our constitutional system in our schools. But really, when you think about it, aren't these last two issues every bit as important as all the others? In fact, if I had to point to a reason for most of the problems this country is experiencing right now, I would point to the cultural influences that are pulling younger Americans away from American principles. Principles which are not so much being thoughtfully rejected as they are simply disappearing from ignorance and neglect. If the new generation never learns what makes our country work and what makes our country great, then America will have lost its way. And the process of education has to begin, not only in our schools, but in our public debates. The two changes I've spoken about today, the weakening of local control by the Obama administration's new housing regulation and the creation of a de facto national school curriculum, should both be discussed and debated far more widely. For example, if the presidential candidates, who aren't here anymore, started to take up these two issues, I believe those candidates would get a great deal of attention from potential voters. This is a moment in which Republican and conservative voters and candidates are disagreeing amongst themselves about the best way to restore the good that so many of us feel has been lost in this country. Some Republicans say that what's needed is not more negativism about the president's policies, but a positive program of reform that will help Republicans reach out to new constituencies. Other Republicans and conservatives say that it's time to name without fear and then take a hammer to all of the Obama administration's fundamental transformations, all of the changes that have put what's best in America at risk. I believe we can do both. I believe we can present a positive program of reform while also speaking the truth about the very troubling and dangerous transformations this country now faces. And I believe that the candidate who best does both of these things will unite the party and take the nomination. And that would be the very best chance we have to restore and defend all that we value in this country.